Hi. Instead of talking about food again, we're going to talk about Hiroshige. Hiroshige is, together with Hokusai, among the two most recognized ukiyo-e artists. Basically, if you have a vague idea about what ukiyo-e are, the few pictures you do know are likely to be from either of these artists. So to properly talk about Hiroshige, we're going to have to establish what ukiyo-e are. Ukiyo-e are a genre of Japanese art, most famously woodblock prints, that is closely linked to the city of Edo. So what is Edo? Edo, which is pronounced Edo, not Edo by the way, was the original name of Tokyo during the appropriately named Edo period. Now, we're not going into great detail about ukiyo-e or Edo today, as each of those could easily fill their own video. We're just going to establish some basics that help us with our discussion of Hiroshige. Let's get to it! Right, before we get to talk about ukiyo-e or Edo, we have to establish the background those two things arose from, because history is annoying like that. Japan was just exiting the Sengoku Jidai, the 150-year period of internal war, and about to enter an unprecedented era of peace, when Edo became the seat of the shogunate in 1603. Now, even before the Sengoku Jidai, Japan had seen its fair share of warfare. So Japan was a fairly martially oriented society. In fact, while the emperor, or Tenno, remained the nominal, symbolic and religious leader of Japan, all the military and political power came to lay in the hand of Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu. Well, the emperor had arguably not had any real power since the Heian period. There had instead been a Sessho and a Kampaku, a regent or chief advisor respectively, who ruled in effect but justified their power over the connection with the Tenno. Think Jafar or Wormtongue. These earlier positions were appointed only with the approval of the shogun, giving him the ultimate power, but still, they worked within the pre-existing system of governance. Tokugawa Ieyasu, having gathered all the military power under his direct rule, apparently felt less need to align himself with the Tenno's imperial court. So he didn't bother with it. Problem was that the title of shogun was still technically an imperial title, and the Tenno was supposed to be, you know, a descendant of the gods? So Tokugawa couldn't just boot the guy. But what he could do was to set up his own center of power that operated independently from the imperial court. That way, he could overhaul the political structure from the ground up, while leaving the old one in place, at least symbolically, unchanged. Which is what Edo is. When the shogunate set up shop in Edo Castle, they created a new, dynamic political system, which could act much quicker and more decisive than the ancient system of the imperial court had been able to. Soon, the previously minor city of Edo grew and expanded massively, swelling to 1 million inhabitants within about a century, as opposed to the European capital cities which had taken centuries to grow and develop. This dynamism, as opposed to the slower-paced ancient city of Kyoto, defined a large part of Edo's self-perception. There was a notable break with tradition here, which goes so far that you can actually see it from space, if you've brought, like, a good telescope. See, while Edo looks like this, just a big mess that gradually grew outward from the castle, Kyoto looks like this, with the area surrounding the imperial palace being built in a grid after ancient Chinese ideals of architecture. In fact, Chinese ideals had dominated Japanese high culture and art for such a long time that most Japanese schools of art were, in effect, indistinguishable from their Chinese counterparts. And a whole lot of philosophy and tradition was mixed up with it. This made art inaccessible to the uneducated, and indeed, it was mostly the domain of the upper classes. And that is a situation in which ukiyo-e developed as a uniquely Japanese art form. Ukiyo-e, which wasn't initially associated with woodblock printing, translates to pictures of the floating world. The aim was to depict the fleeting beauty of the real world, thereby juxtaposing it to the more esoteric goals of traditional art with its timeless, idealized depictions of nature. So while ukiyo-e might look abstract and stylized to a Western audience, they were actually an attempt at realism. This lowered the bar to appreciating art, opening it up to a new possible audience, the working class. But they had to be able to afford it first, so let's turn our attention back to Edo. The city was ruled by the shogun, who didn't exactly trust the unflinching loyalty of his daimyo. There had been over a century's worth of open warfare after all. So he forced them to maintain mansions in Edo, to keep their families there, and to keep an alternate attendance system, where they would live 1 year in Edo and the next in their respective prefectures. This led to an unusually high number of daimyo in the city that would normally spend their time in distant prefectures. Each of them brought and maintained their own personal retinue and samurai. As a result, a significant portion of the nation's military power resided in Edo at any given point. That's a lot of samurai. As much as half of the city's population. Many of them traveled with their lords and were not permanent residents in Edo. Within the shogunate government, rice was the primary currency, with retainers, like samurai, being paid in rice. But with peace came prosperity, and the relative value of food dropped when compared to other items. When the upper echelons of the ruling class could boast great wealth, this led to poverty among many middling to low-ranking samurai, who were precluded from taking any jobs other than bureaucratic positions. The other half of the city were mostly commoners, many of them working-age laborers who profited from the Edo market, which was able to move away from the pre-established establishment of the old capital, allowing them to prosper or fail based on their own work. While laborers were certainly able to make a decent living, the lower classes were anything but rich. The ones who really made it big were merchants. They came to be incredibly wealthy, some even rivaling daimyo in their wealth, which presented somewhat of a problem, as merchants, and indeed exchange agents who tended to make a pretty profit from exchanging the rice of samurai, were outside of the shogunate's official hierarchy, which placed samurai at the top, farmers below, craftsmen even below that, and anyone not included at the very bottom. But wealth-wise, that power structure was steadily being inverted. So the situation is that we have an artistic movement that can be appreciated by commoners, but most commoners being anything but rich. You'd assume that ukiyo-e would only find an audience with the richer merchants then, but you'd be a fool for assuming. The ready availability of skilled labor that Edo provided gave a great opportunity to mass-produce art. Woodblock printing had been a thing for a long time. It had been the primary way to make book printing. Tangent time! Interestingly, Japan knew of letter block printing, but since you'd need an excessive amount of blocks to cover all possible kanji you might need, it was still easier and quicker to carve entire pages. Tangent over. Woodblock printing art had also been a thing, but tended to be done in black and white and sometimes hand-colored, which, of necessity, led to more stylized depictions. But that was an old, stuffy Kyoto. This is Edo, baby, where we invent 2-colored prints. You know what? Why not make it 3 plates of color? 7, 12, why not? Oh, the shogunate made ostentatious works of art illegal. Just what you get for being a scandalous modern art movement that's all up in the face of the man. Alright, we can't use more than 8 color plates, fine, but how about we paint those with gradients? Yeah, let's do that. So now we have color, a way of mass production, and an accessible art form. Everything set in place to be popular with the populace. But how are we going to market this? How do we get this to the people? Souvenirs. I'm serious. Early ukiyo-e prints depicted actors and sumo wrestlers, functioning as advertisements. However, they were soon joined by landscapes and literal guidebooks, which saw tremendous popularity. Ukiyo-e soon became popular souvenirs for visitors to Edo to take back home. This was instrumental in projecting the fierce municipal pride that developed in Edo throughout the country, and thus helped spreading its culture. Throughout its existence, ukiyo-e maintained this close connection to the city of Edo, with Edo continuing to be the center of both production and consumption of ukiyo-e, not to mention quite frequently also being the object depicted. Now that we've gotten a decent idea of what ukiyo-e are, finally we can talk about what we know about Hiroshige. Not a lot as it turns out, but more than we have about most ukiyo-e artists. We know from his memorial portrait that he died at the age of 62, which allows us to surmise that he was likely born in 1797. He was born to the samurai caste, and he inherited his father's post of firekeeper at the age of 12, shortly before his father died, orphaning him. The position was, in all likelihood, largely symbolic. It left him with an income that likely wasn't great. So, like many of his samurai contemporaries, Hiroshige faced a choice between poverty or menial work. Since he had a noted talent for painting, he went into apprenticeship in 1811 at age 14. His master was Utagawa Toyohiro. Hiroshige had tried to be accepted by the more famous Utagawa Toyokuni, but that didn't work out. Within 1 year, Hiroshige had earned his name Hiroshige, as well as a sort of pen name Ichi-Ryūzai, which he occasionally shortened to Ryūzai. In the Edo period, people changed names frequently. I'm not going into detail now, but people assumed new names to signify new life stages. Hiroshige's first name, which happens to be said last in Japanese, was Tokutaro. That had already changed to Juemon at this point. For simplicity's sake, we will stick to the name Hiroshige because that's the one he's best known under. The pen name Ichi-Ryūzai had also been used by his teacher Utagawa Toyohiro, but with a different spelling. The name Hiroshige is written like this, with the syllable hiro being spelled the same way as the hiro in Toyo-hiro. Meanwhile, Shige is a different pronunciation for the first syllable of Hiroshige's prior name, Juemon. so we can see a clear continuity of naming here, where Hiroshige's very name honors both his teacher and his past. And indeed, this was the tradition, especially in the Utagawa school, which Hiroshige had become a part of. The term school is misleading here. While there are some similarities in style, it's not one unified art style. Rather, the name alludes to a lineage of apprenticeship that can be traced back ultimately to Utagawa Toyoharu. Initially, Hiroshige followed his master's school's example closely, publishing images of kabuki actors and women. This was very much the bread and butter of Ukiyo-e Artists. And I'm going to quote one of my sources in translation here, because I just love that sentence too much. All in all, his accomplishments up to this point did not suggest an overwhelming talent. This changed, however, in 1832, about a decade after his then infant son Nakajiro was old enough to take over the duties of the family's fire marshal position. And Hiroshige started publishing his first great series, the 53 Stations of the Tokaido. The series, showing views of then contemporary Japan along the Tokaido, the main road connecting the new capital of Edo with the ancient capital of Kyoto, while roughly following the coast, was inspired by the earlier series 36 Views of Mount Fuji by Hokusai. Hiroshige's work, however, was more naturalistic than the more impressionistic Hokusai. 1856 saw the publishing of Hiroshige's second famous series, 100 Famous Views of Edo. Hiroshige had published countless pictures over several series, books and caricatures in the meantime, but Tokaido and Edo are his most famous series by some margin. With so many, and especially his famous series, being depictions of places, one could be forgiven for thinking that Hiroshige was an avid traveler, and indeed he claimed as much, suggesting that his pictures are as close to reality as he could make them. But while we know that he did get inspiration from travel journals, we don't know for certain if he traveled at all, so there's that. So he's got two very famous series and an admittedly impressive body of other works of varying acclaim. What exactly is it though that makes Hiroshige stand out from other artists to the point where he has become one of the two most famous masters of ukiyo-e? Well, that really has no definitive answer. Art can be annoying that way. Like history. However, there are a few striking characteristics of his work. For example, his grasp of blocking and the interplay between fore and background is simply masterful, and he helped establishing the vertical print for landscapes, suggesting the format of older hanging wall scroll paintings. His art also has a subjectivity to it that conveys mood very well. He's particularly good at using evocative little scenes that enhance the mood of the piece and can even be comedic. He's especially talented at presenting intrigue to his pieces, while adding tiny details to reward the careful observer, though he doesn't often depict labor scenes. Also, he really loved the use of Prussian blue, which was an incredibly deep blue that pops up in a huge amount of his prints, quite often in his skies, which, in many cases, have a red lining suggesting sunset or sundown. This lining is one example of his many uses of the bokashi effect, which is a color gradient achieved by working on the colors on the printing plate before the print. Hiroshige's prints also tend to have clear weather, with only 3 images of the more than 120 in his 100 Views of Edo depicting rain. And he also depicted a large amount of places that hadn't previously been covered by other artists. But what may be most significant is that Hiroshige managed to combine the virtues of 3 approaches to art probably better than anyone else. The first was the more traditional Chinese-inspired art scene, with its highly idealized views of nature that frequently utilized the bird's eye or even flat perspectives. The second was the more realistic Western approach, with depth of field that tended to use central perspective that were closer to reality. Finally, there was ukiyo-e, which had grown out of a break with the more traditional Chinese art and developed its own naturalistic perspective, making it, to a certain extent, compatible with both the other art traditions. By utilizing and interweaving aspects of these 3 approaches, Hiroshige managed a breadth of techniques that was staggering. That is why he has many landscapes that feature humans in a minor, almost incidental capacity, why his work features bird's eye perspectives, central perspectives, and close-ups, as well as views with more modern depth of field and vanishing points. The more Western aspects of his work might also have been responsible for why his work was very popular in Europe. There, the more abstract aspects of Hiroshige's work struck a nerve with the art scene, where the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists appreciated Hiroshige's work, but sadly only after Japan opened up in 1862. Some 4 years after Hiroshige's death in 1858. Van Gogh and other famous painters collected, were inspired by and even outright imitated his work. This despite the fact that Asian art in general had been dismissed in the 17th and 18th century. True, the European art scene in the 19th century was actively looking for new expressionistic inspirations, but it should still be noted that it was Hiroshige who himself was influenced by European techniques, and whose art style was therefore more recognizable to them, who was among the most popular artists they took that inspiration from, rather than some more traditional artists. What is fascinating here, and what motivated me to make this video in the first place, is that Hiroshige's popularity mirrors the rise of ukiyo-e itself. He used new inspirations and methods, thereby finding a way to make Japanese art more accessible by lowering the knowledge necessary to be able to appreciate it, like using universally understood realism and perspectives that a Western audience was able to recognize. It should also be noted that his landscapes too harken back to the early ukiyo-e travel guides, with his second famous series again focusing on the marvelous city of Edo. This allowed ukiyo-e to portray Edo to the rest of the country and, indeed, the world.